I also had like 4 different majors. So I don't know if you guys have switched majors yet. I finished with 2, so I did finish with 2 majors, but I took about 4 total. I wanted to be the major that made the most money first off, and then I changed it as I moved on through graduate school. So, any questions about our chapters to this point? Because we're kind of creeping into chapter. Finished up 3 last week, and then 4. Actually, where is 3? Let me see here for you guys. So yeah, we were finishing up with 3, and I told you we'll get to modern day as quickly as I can, because sometimes the history stuff is boring, but it helps make sense of why we have social welfare policy in the first place. And one thing that kind of becomes clear is it's always the rich holding the not so rich down. So from feudalization in Europe, and I know we already went through these, the Middle Age serfs, they did indentured servitude. Middle Age had surpluses, and we went through all this. The poor laws, 14th and 15th centuries, that was kind of the dark ages. So stuff was really bad. You guys ever heard of the Black Plague before? Which, I guess there were so many dead people that they had to, that's where that song Ring Around the Rosie is from, I think. Because there were so many dead people, they just had to, wheel them out in wheelbarrows, and they show it in, Monty Python. So I know that's why we all wear a mask now, is it's supposed to prevent, all the dead people everywhere from dying, but I don't know if this is as bad of a pandemic as 100 years ago and 400 years ago. Martin Luther started all of the Protestant denominations like Lutheran, Baptist. He was pissed at the riches of the Catholic Church at that point. They kind of did the poor laws. So I'm cruising through these to get us to, now we are at the American experience, actually. And how can I get to go big? So in the American experience, if it lets me do the settlement, so there is settlement labor, imported poor laws. So the workhouses in the colonies were established to deal with the jobless poor. I forgot it does this weird thing at the bottom. Everything that I say, it reads across the screen, and I don't know how to change that. Something on PowerPoint that has been saved. So they would try to reduce the tax rates through their labor. In America, as you know, it was mostly Native Americans and folks that had come across, I think it was Asia. So they came up through Russia, walked down Alaska, Canada, and Native Americans in 1200, 1300, 1400, and 1500 until the Spanish came. I guess, was Columbus from Spain? Does anybody know? I should know this. And I don't. But where is Christopher Columbus from? So he was the first dude that he thought that he was finding. He thought India, right? Is that why he called it what he called it?
Yeah.
I don't even remember what he called it.
He thought he was going to India, so that's why he called Native American.
Indians. Okay. So he was kind of a jerk, I feel like. It was the norm back then too, in the 16 and 1700s. Social welfare policy, like I said, was always the rich people, and even back then, the people who had the muskets and the guns in charge, finding ways to overreach on the poor people. So before he got here, there was the encomenderos. They were expected to profit from entitlements to their continuous services of the natives. In return, they were expected to maintain a church and a priest for Native Americans. And they always had like a militia. So this is like, I guess this would be like the 1600s. Another question I don't know. Does anybody know what year the gun was invented? Because if they had a militia, I feel like they didn't have guns until the 1500s or the 1600s. Like they had those muskets where they'd like bite it off, like put the barrel in, and so that's all they had. But that's kind of how they took charge of. They took over the damn United States and took over the American Indians. So the early Spanish influence, Mexicans and other Hispanics, they forced them to accept cash advances. It's almost like those money day loans. You guys ever seen those places where like, give us your paycheck today? And how do they do that? We'll give you an advance on the paycheck before you even get it, but then when you get the paycheck, you give us half. Like they really screw you. So it's almost the same idea here with like cash advances. They had to buy goods that were priced high against the expected harvest, sell harvested crops at a lower than market price set by the Spaniards. So these dudes were dicks. Like they were just setting all kinds of rules because they had freaking guns. And that's kind of what it came down to. Then there was the second thing, said a mutual aid among African Americans. So black codes were passed in the South following the Civil War. So we're up to 1865 now. And this restored forced labor conditions on plantations. It denied freed persons political liberty and restrict the economic opportunities and mobility of freed slaves. So even though there was the Emancipation Proclamation in 1865 by Abraham Lincoln, there are all these messed up laws and rules really for 40, 60, 80 years. And those were some of the messed up laws. I think one of them would have been, was it like 3/5 or 5/3? Then the American Indians in the U.S. history had the Trail of Tears. So this also was around that mid of the 1800s, which I think they call the 19th century. So they were forced west. And the land, if anybody's ever been out west, the land actually kind of sucks. It's like really dry. The soil's not good. Like we got amazing soil in Ohio and like Georgia, even Louisiana, because it's like rich swamp areas. But then you go out west and I swear you can only grow like the weird GMO corn, soybeans, and like wheat. So they pushed all the Native Americans west in 1831 to Oklahoma. They had to travel 1,000 miles. And back then we did not have cars until about 1900. So this is walking, and maybe they had a wagon with wheels to pull their stuff. You guys ever play that game called Oregon Trail? You ever heard of that? It was like the only game we had as kids in the 1980s on like the green screen, and you have to like travel out west and not die. So that's kind of what they're doing. Like imagine walking, and maybe you had a horse to pull your wagon all the way of 1,000 miles, which would be the distance from here to like almost New York, or even the other way to Colorado and or Kansas. So the shelter was inadequate. Imagine sleeping outside in this. Like the next 3 days, we're going to have 3 single-digit temperature days. It's going to be 0, 7, and 9 on like Friday, Saturday, Sunday. And it's hard to sleep outside in that crap. Like, I don't even know how. So many, many people died. 4,000 Cherokee Indians died along the way. Getting up to 1887. So the American Indians in U.S. history, a lot of messed up history. The General Allotment Act was known as the Dawes Act. It broke up tribal communal land holdings. So if you guys know anything of Native Americans, they would have like large areas of land that they would hunt buffalo and bison and kind of follow them and, like kill them for their meat with the bow and arrow often. Sounds like the Spaniards after 1886 broke up those tribal communal land holdings. They distributed them into individual shares for agricultural and grazing purposes, and allowed Native Americans to become voting citizens if they broke from their tribe. So they're kind of breaking up their community. Indian Reorganization Act, this was after 1890. It permitted tribes to reorganize their own institutions and to handle many of their own concerns. So again, the common theme of the person with the money and the guns making unfair laws and reorganizing crap to their own making. So they would reorganize their own institutions, handle many of their own concerns. The Bureau of Indian Affairs sustained a veto power. And I think today there still are Native American tribes that are free from state law. Have any of you visited some of those before? We don't have many around here. They're mostly out west. We have a couple in the east, but I would say they're Oklahoma, Minnesota, east of the Mississippi River, if you went out there. And they don't have to follow the U.S. laws. They actually do still make their own laws because they were the original people on that land. The Freedmen's Bureau, and I promise once we get into the 1900s, it gets fast moving and more exciting, especially the monetary policy, because one might ask, and I know we were showing you the gold coins and silver coins from before, like how did they manipulate a lot of these laws and ways to own things? And part of the way they do it nowadays, still to this day, is monetary policy. So they change what the dollar is worth and what the dollar can buy. Like if you notice how much you get with a dollar, like when I was born, you could buy a house for like $20,000 and a car for $3,000, like a brand new car, amazing, beautiful cars for $3,000. But then we changed money policy and inflation hit hard in the late 70s into the 80s, and all the prices started going way up again. So we introduced a workable system of labor in the South. We attempted to secure equal justice from state and local governments. Also in the mid 1860s, there were veterans and a suspension of ethics. So the Homestead Act made it possible for American citizens to obtain up to 160 acres of unoccupied government land. So as long as you lived on this land for 5 years and grew food and grazed it with your cattle, you were given that land. Union soldiers could count their time in military service towards the 5-year prerequisite. So if they were in the military up until the Emancipation Proclamation in 1865, 160 acres is a lot. Does anybody know what that would sell for nowadays if you bought 100 acres of land? Most good farmland is like $5,000 per acre. If you have amazing flat, cleared with no trees farmland where they can get the big John Deere tractors in, it's like $10,000 to $12,000 per acre. So if you had 100 acres and it's $10,000 per acre, anybody good at math to figure that one out? 10,000 times 100 acres. Yeah, I guess so. Yeah, it would be $1 million. So if you bought that nowadays, and because they wanted to inhabit the West, and there's tons of wide open land still out west, and people died doing it. I think in Montana you still can do this. Like you can homestead, like you go live on a piece of land and take care of it, but it is freaking cold. Like you got to work your butt off to do that. So they still do have some of this left. Also, veterans and the suspension of the ethic. Servicemen's Readjustment Act, it guaranteed loans to buy a home, farm, or business. We even have some of this today, 52 weeks of unemployment insurance. I feel like that's been cut to 26. So if you're laid off at a job, some of you will see this on your pay stub. It says unemployment insurance. You pay money into that like every paycheck. And if they lay you off, it guarantees that you'll get money back from the government at like a percentage of what you are making. And it also provided job placement services up to federal aid for learning or training. One last thing about veterans. So post 9/11, this is getting into the common era. So in 2001, were some of you guys born in 2001? Is that okay? That's what I feel. So you don't remember like the building like crashed and fall. Yeah, that was crazy. I'll get out. They still had this stuff going on. Veterans had education assistance. So if you went to fight in Afghanistan or in, where else are we? Iraq, you get free college if you come out alive. I have friends that were deployed there, and they're still 20 years later in Afghanistan. That blows my mind. So they got tuition, supplies, and stipends, active duty after 9/11. I had a friend who got a master's degree in counseling because of that. So this is kind of common era. Like if you ever see all the military guys, like they have ROTC here, I think. Is that Reserve Officer Training Corps? I think if you do that, in 4 years, you're trained to be an officer, which is kind of high up in the military. They pay for your education, which is kind of cool. I didn't do it, but some folks did. So as we cruise through this, getting us to the modern era, which we are now, some thoughts come to mind. The social Darwinism, and that's the origin of species. And Charles Darwin wrote this book. He proposed that concepts of natural selection and evolution, the survival of the fittest. So those of us who work hardest should be well taken care of. Like kind of the idea in America nowadays that we get freedom by working hard and working for the almighty dollar. So one thing that we get into monetary policy here in the next chapter, and something important about that is knowing how we mess with monetary policy nowadays. And it is really hard to understand. So, any of you guys ever buy a certificate of deposit at a bank? It's called like a CD, and you get interest on your money if you set it there. And 10 years ago, they gave you 5% interest. So it was like great money. Like sometimes we even had like 10,000 left over from our student loans in graduate school, and you just set that in the bank. And 5%, you make $500 a year just by sitting the money in the bank, and you could pay it back off. So it was great interest. Today, does anybody know what our interest rate is sitting at by chance? If you were to guess. And a lot of old people really depend on the interest of money to live off of. Like they have a large savings of either a pension or a 401k, and they used to be able to have, if you had $100,000 in the bank, you would make $5,000 a year that way. And if you had done like your 401k, I guess some people have a goal of having $1 million in the bank, then you would, in interest, you would make $50,000 a year. And you can live off of that. You know what I mean? Like just the interest alone, you can live off $50,000 a year, depending on how frugal and simple you live. Today, the current interest rate, were you all old enough to remember the crash of 2009 and see people get laid off, have family members get laid off, maybe even friends? You all would have been 10, 11, 12, and 13 maybe during the Great Recession. And it was like this major crash that happened. So the interest rate was at 5. It was September of 2008. And like literally within a few months, they dropped the interest rate a 0.5 point like every month, all the way down to right now we're at 0. So if you put your money in the bank, you get 0 interest. Doesn't even matter if you have $1 million in the bank or if you have $10 in the bank. In fact, they charge you so many fees. Some people argue that we have a negative interest rate. Like they have a bank account, you got to pay money sometimes. Do any of you pay money for your bank account? Don't pay money for your bank account. Give the banks a middle finger and like go to a credit union or like somebody else that does not charge you, because that's some of the stuff that I think is unconscionable. Like they're taking our money, or like the ATM, you know, they give you fees to get cash out sometimes. That's where it feels like we're getting ripped off. So monetary policy has really shifted to like out in the open from 1100 to 1900 to it was about 1913 we had something called the Federal Reserve Act, and it changed the way money policy was given here. And we're currently kind of going through the struggle of that, bringing it to modern day. Has anybody heard of GameStop, the stocks? Would you be willing to tell me what you know about it? Because it's hard to explain. I still barely understand it, but a lot of people bought it last week and made like 200%.
Well, GameStop was going out of business. Before it went out of business, but a lot of people overseas began to invest in it. So now, I guess like the worth of their stocks went up. So now everybody's investing in it, but they're expecting it to still close soon. So it's like buy now or.
Right. So getting into the monetary policy and how the big bankers screw all of us and our whole lives. And I hate to talk that way, but I don't know any other way to describe it. Like, it seems that every little thing that we do, we have like a fee, or you got to pay like, I even noticed that they charge you guys like a late registration fee. I'm like, what the hell is that? So it's like, is it like $300 if you don't register in time? Stuff like that, like really, and maybe they can justify that somehow. Anybody else know stuff about the GameStop? People made like thousands, and apparently the hedge funds lost $70 billion on Friday. $70 billion. So that's like, wow. And some people are arguing that it's screwing the big guy. So it's the little guy getting back at the little guy. And it's hard to find information on a lot of this stuff because they're like throwing videos out and like you can't get info on what's going on. So again, this kind of goes back to the monetary policy and the way it's kind of a game how they play. Does anybody here invest in stocks? Do you guys do like stock markets or Robinhood? Or because Robinhood's supposed to be like a free app that you get, and they give you like $5 to invest, and then you can like play the game. But I still feel like the big hedge funds have a way of like screwing you. Somebody sent me free stock on it, so I looked it up. But in the long haul, it looked like a mess. It looked like it was, let's see here. So I'm kind of getting you all ready for what's called the Federal Reserve Act, and that was in 1913. And there'll be pretty good descriptions on what's going on with the money system, the monetary system. So we are getting into modern day world America and poverty. In high school, did they have you guys volunteer at any places before? Like, is that only like Catholic schools, I guess? Like, if you do.
We had in order to graduate, we have like alternatives. That was one of our things, like in order to graduate, if you didn't have the main requirements, you could do volunteer work, but that was
so like usually a soup kitchen or a homeless shelter, or where would you?
It didn't matter which volunteer. For some students, volunteers like help teachers clean up their room.
Okay, so you guys were exposed to some of the areas that were impoverished in your city. Which cities are you guys from again? As I always ask this, it helps me get a context for like, any Cincinnatians? Nope. Chicago? No, that was a big one. What cities? I should just say. What cities are you guys from? Columbus. Okay. Toledo. Akron. Okay. So like all within a few hours, like you could drive home in 3.5 hours, right? Okay. And you guys have areas of town where you have like the social service agencies, the food pantries, the soup kitchens, and is it 8 Mile in Detroit, or is that not the proper context? Like where?
8 Mile?
Yeah. Is it 8 Mile for real? I know I've seen it on like the movies, that they show areas And then what was the big, so it was when the cars started moving, like manufacturing moved out to Mexico and China instead of Detroit. That's when it got real bad in Detroit, if I remember. Okay. And this is kind of what we're going to discuss now. In Columbus, I feel like they've reinvigorated the downtown recently. Like, do they have a lot of gentrification and all the old buildings are fixing them up, and it's renting now like for $1,000 a month. We have the same thing going on in Cincinnati. Like all these old dilapidated buildings built in 1890, people are rehabbing them, fixing them, and then the rent now, which was $300 or $400 a month 10 or 20 years ago when I lived in Over the Rhine. Now it's $1,000 to $1,200 a month for rent in the inner city. Which city are you from? So this is kind of getting to the details of what's happening with poverty and what's going on with the American experience. And we're just going to dip into this because my goal is to finish by like 3:15 and put some of this stuff online for you guys. Because this is the origins of social work. So the 3 discoveries of poverty. Is that the other classroom? It sounded like it was right in here. That's crazy. I hope our roof isn't falling in. Uh-oh. Got a coffee stain on the ceiling, or somebody went like that with their coffee. All right, so Lester Ward suggests restraining power is needed to regulate the conduct of individuals toward one another, prevent the wholesale exploitation of the weak by the strong. And we see this argument today even with like the minimum wage. And there are good arguments on both sides. Like $15 an hour is about what you need to live and raise a family. Both mom and dad would have to be making that. $15 an hour is about $30,000 a year if you get 40 hours a week. In the 70s and 80s, American families were allowed to live, able to live with one breadwinner. So like either mom worked all the time or dad worked all the time. And one of them stayed home and took care of the kids. By like the 90s, some of the money policy had changed and shifted that it took about 1.5 people. So like mom would have a part-time job or dad would have a part-time job and mom the full-time job. In like the 2000s, and you'll notice this with, the way we were even parented, there was more like 2 people had to work. So either dad had to have 2 jobs or mom had to have a job and dad had to have a job. Nowadays, like the 2010s and the 2020s, it feels like you need 2.5 jobs, full-time jobs, which would be like 100 hours a week of work to like support a normal family, which is crazy. Do you guys know what the poverty level is? Like how much money would put you at poverty for what's that?
35.
That probably is for a 4-person family. Because I feel like, it's somewhere between 25 and 35, and it's constantly changing. Like if we looked it up, like the debt clock. What did you guys think about that debt clock, by the way? Did you know we had that much debt in America? And will we pay it back? That's kind of like my question all the time. Are we going to pay it back in time? It blows my mind sometimes. Current day, we're arguing over a bill in Congress right now. So it's called the Pandemic Bill of America. I think one side wants to give out 600 billion. The other side wants to give out $1.9 trillion. So they're fighting about the details of the bill. We might all get that check again. Did any of you all get the check? I know I asked you that. Your parents all got it? Usually. Like I think you get 1,000 and then for every dependent you would get 500. But if you worked and paid taxes last year, you might get another $1,000 check. That's kind of what they're arguing over. So again, this is really just to pay rent. So a lot of people in big cities, New York, maybe even Detroit, Chicago, they're behind on rent. So that's part of what they're shifting towards to help people out. Like there's a moratorium on rent right now. The last of the 3 discoveries of poverty, there's this social gospel that stated no person can be redeemed and saved alone. God hates injustice. Hello. And the kingdom of God is the real solution to, this is interesting. So again, they're going back to, like we talked about last week, religion. Religion and the fact that we all serve one another. We all take care of each other. If you see someone who's hungry, we need to feed them or find them food and teach them how to fish. Maybe teach them housing. And then the progressive era. There was reform in business and politics. The belief poverty was a result of the structure of society and could be fixed by people and the government. So there was a time when religiously people really thought, like, if you were poor, it's because you were a sinner. And it's hard to explain, but they're like, oh, they're having a hard time in life. That must mean they pissed off God. And so luckily in the 1900s, we kind of shifted some of that thinking and they turned it around to see we could actually maybe give a person a hand up to help them out. So the fading of the first discovery in 1921, which is very similar to right now. So it's exactly 100 years ago. We're in 2021. In 1921, do anybody remember what they called the 1920s by chance? Yes. So like The Great Gatsby, do they still have you read that book? And dude was rich. He was actually a bootlegger, so that's why he made all the money. But like stock market was freaking cool. Cars were just invented. People were, money was flowing like everywhere. And it's very similar to what they say the stock market is doing right now in 2021. I think a year ago it was at 18,000 and now we're at 30,000 in the stock market, which is weird. The free money, so like handing out the checks, they're drawing a lot of correlations from 1921 to 2021. But the scary thing is, does anybody remember what happened after the Roaring 20s? October of 1929. Then what happened after that? For 10 years. Yep. And that's when a lot of our social policy was passed. So hello, welcome. How are you? So yeah, very similar today as we saw in 1921. So I'll finish up with kind of these last 2 slides because I promised you I'll put some of this material online for the hybrid part. So the Shepherdtown Act was to provide grants to states to develop preventative health services for mothers and children, which we still do nowadays. And 10 years ago, we created Affordable Care Act and Obamacare, and we're seeing some of that come back so that we have at least basic health care for everybody. And then also to combat the high maternal infant death rates. So strangely enough, all the cities that you guys named, we have the highest sudden infant death syndrome rates in like all of America. For some reason, the Midwest has extremely high SIDS. So 100 years ago, they actually passed acts to slow this down. We're still at a rate that they want to push it down even more because we're in modern America and, not as many should be dying of SIDS. So right after the Roaring 20s, we had exactly what you guys called it, the Great Depression. And we pushed a lot of social welfare laws back then. And this was President Hoover. He initially thought a return of confidence would correct the failing economy. So he thought that he could get people confident in the economy again somehow. But that failed, and he supported federal loans to states for their relief efforts. So he started giving out. This is kind of when some of the printing of money began. Like he would give away cash to each state to take care of the poor. The government was forced to act because of the massive amounts of unemployed. I mean, have you guys seen pictures of the Great Depression before? Just like the soup lines, I should say. Soup kitchen, that's it. So we don't see it as much nowadays because the food stamp card is just like, we got it in graduate school. It's just like a credit card, but it has like the American flag on it. So we don't see this as much nowadays because now we can, you get about 200 a month in food stamps if you sign up for them and you're making under that poverty line we mentioned of like 20,000, probably for an individual, 15,000 for a family of two, like 20 to 25,000 for a family of 3 or 4. It's like 30 to 35,000. So this is kind of what it looked like. And there are dudes everywhere, like holding out signs, kind of begging, all over the place. Anybody happen to know what got us out of the Great Depression by chance? They mentioned Hoover tried to do different policies and different laws. But there's one thing that got us out, and it, in my mind, it doesn't really make any sense at all. Yep. World War II, actually. So, I was in a different area. So there's also somebody that correlated the pandemic lines. Did you see the lines for the food pantry in 2020? There's only one major difference, but it almost looks the same. So I think this one was in like New York. Yeah, here we go. Long lines of the food bank across the U.S. So, oh, here's one. This one was actually in the Midwest. So they're, the difference is they have cars, like in the 20s, not many people had cars. It's kind of an interesting concept. So maybe it's come a little bit sooner. What city is that? Is that Dallas? So because of the pandemic, you were socially distanced and most people got the handouts from their car. So because of the coronavirus pandemic, 17 million more Americans are facing hunger or could face hunger. That was like one of the news pieces because the layoffs were around 40 or 50 million people and the unemployment rate spiked. I mean, it was pretty high. So these ones kind of shock me when they have like 18 different lines all in a row to divide. And there still are these with the grocery carts and socially distanced. But we're kind of at the precipice of a very similar event, with like layoffs, and that's kind of why we're printing money like crazy right now. We printed $3 trillion in March. I think we're going to print $2 trillion next month, and we probably all will see another check. But things are shifting, and whether or not any president can get us out of there is kind of to be seen. So back then, Hoover tried to get us out. Do you guys remember the president during the Great Depression? Not to like keep banking on history. The only dude that serves like 4 different terms.
Was it Wilson?
I think he was around then, but it's the guy up on the screen. He was everybody's favorite, like FDR. And again, they were pushing out large amounts of legislation. They were establishing new programs. It, again, is very similar to you. Does anyone know how many executive orders we saw last week? Like with the new laws that are being passed with the pandemic legislation. I feel like we had 40 executive orders. So we're doing very similar to what we did during the Great Depression. And this is the last one we get onto, as I promised you, early departure. So the third discovery was in the 60s. The key to poverty was thought to be lack of opportunity. So strategies were chosen to deal with poverty. We focused on services and opportunities for self-advancement, and then began the war on poverty. So this is also the year that we stopped using silver as a monetary metal, because you can't print silver money. But when they stopped giving out silver quarters and silver dimes, we were able to print paper money. Like we were able to print $3 trillion last year. We could not have done that if we still had silver coins. We were able to print 1 trillion in the year 2010 or 2009. And the concern is the same thing that happened to either Zimbabwe or Weimar Germany of hyperinflation could be upon us. So that's kind of like the worry. And so I have a few videos that deal with the Federal Reserve System, which we get into very soon, but I will get those up online for the discussion and kind of be sure. I know it's due at the end of the month, but I wanted to field any questions if you guys had them on the first paper, which is the policy paper. So the individual social welfare topic paper. I'm going to let you choose to do the presentation either on this paper or your second paper. It's entirely up to you. So there'll be one presentation, but not two the way it's written up in here. This has you doing a group one, which if one of you guys wrote on the same thing, you could team up. But I know how group projects go over and they're not always well. So if you want to do the PowerPoint on your first paper, here's the first paper's instructions. So if you had any questions on that, these are ideas for topics. So you could do the unemployment insurance, work compensation, contributions of American business to retirement planning, public assistance programs, temporary assistance for the needy, the supplemental security income, Medicare and Medicaid, food and shelter programs, public housing, Section 8 housing assistance, current shelter issues, and the homeless, publicly funded programs, and other voluntary services. You could do the pandemic bill that was passed last year, if that's something of interest, or the one that they're trying to pass right now, as that is curious to me. If we'll all get that check again. It's just APA, and only 4 pages on this one. The second one is a little longer. So, not due until the end of the month. So that's the, yeah, figured.
Do the presentation or the paper for one, or we have to do both for the next one?
So we'll do 2 papers, but I'm only going to have you do 1 presentation. So you choose to do the presentation on this paper, or if you want to do it as on the second paper. And I'll have them both towards the end, like March, April, and May of the semester, so you can present on your topic. That way there's not, the class is too big to have 2 presentations. And I think you guys would probably appreciate having 1 less presentation, but I could be wrong. Because they're daunting. They're like, making a PowerPoint and whatnot. Not impossible. Stuff you want to know in like normal society, but is it okay to do just 1 presentation instead of 2? I'll check with you guys first.
We can do, you said a PowerPoint?
So yes, the original syllabus has you doing 2 papers and 2 PowerPoints. So I'm just going to have you do 2 papers and 1 PowerPoint. But I want to make sure you guys are okay with that first. It is less work. I know that we have lots of overachievers here and might want to, but for the sake of sanity, I think the class is like 30. So if we had to sit through 60 presentations, we'd have to start doing them like right now. I think 30 would work. And because of the pandemic, I'll give the choice similarly that I've done in other classes where like, if you give it to us, I'll film it for you. And if you'd rather just give it all by yourself and film it yourself from like your cell phone or your laptop, you're welcome to do that too. And we'll put it like into a discussion board. Some people like to do it here because I've got like the little setup to film it and whatnot. So I know that's further on down the line, but just to give you a heads up, I wanted to make sure you guys are cool with doing one less presentation first off. Okay.
What is this core policy thing?
The policy paper?
No, it just says core policy.
What
It has nothing next to it. It just says core policy.
is it in here?
Yes. Right there. At the very top. Oh.
Oh, is it a YouTube discussion? I'm sorry, I didn't write instructions. It's the next discussion board. So about poor kids and policy. That's weird. So maybe I wrote it up in the other one, and then for whatever reason, how we do when we have 170 students, you start losing your mind. I feel like, oh, maybe I did the same thing here. Yep. Okay. So it's the next discussion board. Because there is, so yeah, watch, discuss, and reply to a classmate, and I'll write that in there. Thank you for pointing that out. Sometimes you try to get everything up, because I like to give you like a week head start on it, and then you forget to put the instructions in there. So there'll be at least a discussion every week to 10 days. That's kind of the online component of it. And that, you know what, that is what I had intended to do, but we can do this more of the next class. So if you haven't watched this yet, we'll go ahead and watch that in the next one. Just because
people don't realize what they have until it's gone.
there's some kids they followed.
Whole house growing up poor.
And we're gonna start with numbers 1 through 20.
And they actually had a precursor to this video in like November of 2011. So it's a little bit dated, but it gets the same idea, kind of the policies we give to serve children nowadays. Like the power packs at lunch, they'll give out. Some schools do 3 meals now. They do breakfast, lunch, and dinner, but they used to only do like lunch sometimes, and it's kind of shifted a lot. So any other questions? I'm glad you saw that, because I'm like, where is the instructions? Wow. Right now we only have 1.5 full-time teachers in social work, and a year ago we had 4 full-time teachers in social work. So that's why I have 6 classes. I think even Dr. Allen's teaching extras. Did any of you have Dr. Allen for class? She's awesome. Okay, that is. When is the 7th? Is that on? Okay. Cool. Yeah, because this is technically a hybrid, so it's supposed to be like half and half. Half of your stuff into the online and half of it in person. Courses. Any of you taken 6 classes? Is it crazy? Is it like all day, every day? It is a little bit crazy. Don't they have to sign off if you want to take more than 6? Like if you want to do 21 credit hours? They say It's bad for your health, so we advise against it. But if you get your advisor to sign, you're allowed to take 7 classes. It's crazy. Well, cool. This is yeah. So if you don't have the time to watch this now, we'll try to watch it on Thursday. But they might give me a ding on YouTube, like they take your YouTube video down unless if I say it's for educational purposes only. So if that happens, I'll just tell them to watch that.